thank you, Tammy Bruce, for that extemporaneous and lovely presentation. I might add a little extemporaneous presentation. And we have in the wings waiting now Terrence McNally. So I appreciate that, Terrence. I'm just going to say a few things to complement what she has said, get us back on track. You know, what she said is so true, of course, because we live in a world in which we have a fundamental shift in our perception of the role of government. At the time of the founding of the Republic, with the Founding Fathers' vision of what our republic would be, it was understood to be a limited federal republic defined by a constitution, the aim of which was to maximize protection for individual liberty and to make the individual sovereign and the state its servant. And they followed Lockean principles. You know, there was the opposition political movement to the Hanoverian kings in England in the 18th century. And this led to a destruction of a concept that had reigned throughout the world, and certainly in Europe, called the divine right of kings. And the divine right of kings stood for the proposition that the king was invested by God with rights, plenary rights, and that all others would only have rights by leave of the king. And so you had this centralization of power in the king. The king was an absolute monarch. Until the beheading of Charles I, you had a situation in which the people generally accepted that, groaned under the weight of tyrants, and prayed for kings that were benevolent, but were entirely beholden to a centralized dictator in the form of an absolute monarch. And then, as literacy rates grew in Europe, and as the coffee houses became a hotbed of political discussion with debates raging, suddenly it became clear that the intelligentsia were not limited to those surrounding the court, but included the mass population. From the Gutenberg press through manipulating type and introducing more people to read the Bible and to read other works, they suddenly expanded the zone of literacy to such an extent that an educated populace was capable of appreciating that the law deprived them of rights. And so John Locke, in his two treatises, in his first treatise, he destroys the divine right of kings. In the second treatise, he expounds upon the rights of man. And this rights revolution, which occurred in Europe and fed this movement, had no equal in the world but for the United States, which grew out of it, to create a written constitution in which the rights of man became paramount. No other time in world history a miracle occurred here in which men who were given every opportunity to exploit their power and become dictators themselves chose heroically to abandon that and to instead focus on protecting the rights of man. So we have this creed in the Declaration of Independence, which is such an extraordinary document, struck off in the midst of a revolution under tremendous pressure. The Declaration of Independence stands for those fundamental propositions that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with unalienable rights to life, liberty, and property. They say the pursuit of happiness, but the pursuit of happiness was understood quintessentially to be your right to turn the public domain into private resources for the benefit of mankind, and that government would rest upon the consent of the governed, and that just governments, so long as they were just, would be tolerable and tolerated. But whenever they became unjust, they would be thrown off, and the people would be given the right to reassert such government that would protect their liberties again. And so you see it is that this miracle occurred here, that we have this beautiful thing called the Constitution of the United States, the first written document for the protection of rights in the world. A Constitution of liberty that in its first 3 articles very narrowly defines the powers of government in specific enumerations. And in its Bill of Rights, which by the way, James Madison was a part of the Federalist movement that didn't want to have a Bill of Rights. They didn't think it was necessary. They thought that the first 3 articles of the Constitution was so narrowly defining in its power for the federal government that there would be no need for a Bill of Rights. James Wilson considered it superfluous, and they debated about whether there really needed to be a Bill of Rights. And it was only because of the campaign of James Madison for the first Congress, in which he was accused of being an enemy of the people's rights, that he, in his correspondence with Thomas Jefferson, then in Paris, engaged in this intellectual discussion about the necessity of a Bill of Rights or the need to just rely upon the first 3 articles as sufficient. And Jefferson, presciently and for all time, said, "There is no harm in adding the addition, and it may be essential in times of need when rights are threatened to have the document. It will not be an exclusive list. It will be but a subset of our rights, but we will preserve them there." And so in the first Congress, trying to get the attention of the members of Congress to deviate away from tonnage duty arguments, James Madison introduces what eventually became the Bill of Rights. This is the first time in world history in which a constitution limited the power of government, protected individual liberty as its goal, and added to the Constitution that defined the powers of government a Bill of Rights which for all time would preserve essential liberties. Nowhere else on earth. This experiment is over 200 years old only. Europe looks at that period of time and says, gee, that's just but a moment. Our history is so much longer. And yet, that preservation of liberty that was called for by the Founding Fathers and predicted by them that it would not last unless a vigilant public restored those liberties, is now at stake in everything we do. Every time you turn on a television set, listen to a radio, look at your iPad, whatever, to get news, the story invariably deals with a new deprivation of individual liberty because new George III's are coming to the forefront and are taking control of those things that are your right to decide individually without government, and presuming that they know better than you do what is in your own best interest. And unless we change that dynamic, unless we restore the Constitution of liberty that was given to us, we are lost. We've lost that tether, that mooring to the Constitution that is the definition of America. It is the definition of who we are. The world envies this country only because of that Constitution, only because of that Bill of Rights. It's only because you can be free in the way Jefferson understood freedom to be. He said, "A wise and frugal government shall restrain men from injuring one another, shall leave them otherwise free to regulate their pursuits of industry and improvement, and shall not take from the mouth of labor the bread it has earned." This is the sum of good government. It was the sum of good government then, and it's the sum of good government now. Thank you.